The night my husband's accountant called me by accident, thinking I was someone else, I almost didn't answer. It was a Tuesday. I was making my son's lunch for the next day, peanut butter and honey, crusts cut off, the same lunch I'd made 400 times without thinking. My phone buzzed on the counter. Unfamiliar number, local area code. I picked up because I always pick up. You never know. Mr. Harmon, I've got the Q3 summary ready. The offshore transfer cleared. Just wanted to confirm before I send it to. He stopped, realized, hung up. I stood there with the knife still in my hand, honey dripping onto the cutting board, and I knew. Not suspected, knew. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how I got there. How a woman standing in her kitchen at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday could hear 4 sentences and understand that her entire life had been built on something hollow. And, more importantly, you need to understand what I did about it. My name is Tara. I'm 32 years old. And until 4 months ago, I was married to the most charming man I had ever met. I met my husband when I was 24. I was working at a financial consulting firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. Not a glamorous job, but I was good at it. I tracked numbers for a living, discrepancies, patterns, things that didn't line up. It was detail work, quiet work, the kind most people found tedious. I found it satisfying the way some people find puzzles satisfying. Every number has a reason. You just have to find it. He walked into a client meeting in a navy suit and a confidence that filled the room before he did. He was 30, already running his own logistics company, the kind of man who seemed to have figured out something the rest of us were still working toward. His name was Grant Harmon. He laughed at my questions during the meeting, not dismissively, genuinely, and said afterward that I was the first consultant who'd actually read the materials. We dated for 2 years. Got married when I was 26. Our son Cooper came along 14 months later. Grant's company was growing and he needed help, not a hired hand kind of help, a partner kind of help, someone who understood both the operational side and the financial side. Someone he could trust completely. He looked at me across the kitchen table one evening, Cooper asleep in the next room, and asked if I'd consider coming on as his CFO. Unofficial title. No salary. We were married, he said. So what was the difference? I quit my job. I should have asked more questions about that last part. I didn't. For 5 years, I ran the financial infrastructure of his business. Payroll, vendor contracts, quarterly projections, tax filings. I built spreadsheet systems that his actual accountant complemented. I negotiated payment terms with suppliers. I once caught a billing error that saved us $60,000 in a single quarter. Grant took the client to dinner to celebrate. I stayed home with Cooper. I told myself this was partnership. I told myself we were building something together, even if only one of our names was on the company letterhead. My mother had warned me. She's practical in the way women who lived through difficult things tend to be practical. You need something that's yours, she'd told me more than once. Not secret, just yours. I'd nodded and moved on. I was in love. I thought love was enough of a foundation. I found out it wasn't the way most people find out. Slowly, then all at once. The changes started about 2 years before the phone call. Grant started taking meetings I wasn't included in. Started flying to Atlanta, to Dallas, to Phoenix, always with an explanation, always reasonable. The company was expanding. New markets, new partners. I was busy with Cooper and with the operational work. It made sense. Then things started not adding up in the books. Small things first. A vendor payment that posted to an account I didn't recognize. A line item under consulting fees that had no corresponding invoice. I flagged them in my notes, asked Grant about it. He had explanations. Always explanations. I was too detailed, he said. Sometimes payments got miscoded. It wasn't a big deal. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, and because he said it so easily, the way people do when they've had a lot of practice. But I kept notes. Old habit. Numbers have reasons. About 18 months before the phone call, I found something I couldn't explain away. A wire transfer, $80,000, to an LLC I'd never heard of. I searched the company name. It was registered in Delaware, which isn't unusual, but the registered agent address was a UPS store in suburban Atlanta. I cross-referenced it with our vendor list, our contractor files, our partner agreements. Nothing. I didn't confront him. I know that sounds strange, but I'd watched Grant operate for 6 years by then. He was the most persuasive person I had ever met in my life. If I came to him with $80,000 and a UPS store address, he would look at me like I was being paranoid, like I'd embarrassed myself by even bringing it up, and then he would explain it in a way that made complete sense, and I would feel foolish, and the paper trail would quietly disappear. So instead of confronting him, I started documenting. I'm a details person. It's what I do. So I did it the way I do everything, methodically, quietly, without announcing myself. Over the following months, here is what I found. Grant had taken out a second mortgage on our house 18 months prior. Our home in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte, which we'd bought for $540,000, and which had appreciated to somewhere around $720,000, had an additional $280,000 borrowed against it that I had never seen any paperwork for. I found the lender through a property records search online. Public information. He'd just assumed I'd never look. The company had $340,000 in an outstanding line of credit that wasn't on any of the financial summaries he showed me, a separate set of books essentially. I found it because the lender sent a statement to the business P.O. box that I still handled, and they'd addressed it to him personally rather than to the company. He'd been redirecting everything else. That one slipped through. There was a second phone. I found it charging in the console of his car when I borrowed it for a school pickup. I put it back, said nothing, and there was a property in Atlanta, a condo, leased for $3,200 a month in a building near Midtown. I found the lease buried in a folder on our shared Google Drive. He'd scanned it there by accident 18 months ago and apparently forgotten. The name on the lease was Grant's. The second tenant listed was a woman named after a city I'd never been to, which is how I will always think of her because I chose not to look further. Knowing her name would have hurt more than helped. I already knew enough. I did the math the way I always do, quietly, at the kitchen table after Cooper went to bed with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. Second mortgage, $280,000 outstanding. Property value, $720,000. First mortgage remaining, $300,000. Net equity, roughly $130,000. Not the $400,000 we'd talked about for years. Business line of credit, $340,000. We'd talked about for years. Vendor net 60 accounts I found in the real books, $87,000. Equipment financing, $94,000. Condo in Atlanta based on the lease term, approximately $96,000 remaining. Total hidden liabilities, just under $900,000. Total visible assets at current market value, the house, the business, 2 vehicles. Maybe $1.1 million if everything sold cleanly. Which it wouldn't. We were not wealthy. We were leveraged. Grant had built the appearance of success using money that wasn't his, and a wife who kept meticulous records that he trusted her not to read too carefully. I didn't touch any of it, didn't move money, didn't make calls, didn't change anything. I opened a separate savings account at a credit union across town, in my name only, and began making small deposits from my own earnings. I'd kept a small freelance accounting practice on the side since Cooper was born, 2 or 3 clients a year. Nothing that ever made headlines. That money had always gone into our joint account. Now it went somewhere else. I also called my mother. Not to tell her everything, just to ask her a question. If someone had a retirement account from before a marriage, and they'd never added their spouse to it, and never mixed it with marital funds, what would happen to it in a divorce? She was quiet for a second. Then, why are you asking me that? Research, I said. Tara. Her voice went somewhere careful. You have your 401k from before. You've never touched it. I know. That's separate property if it's never been commingled. I know. Okay, she said. I'm here whenever you're ready to tell me what's actually happening. I wasn't ready yet. I needed one more thing first. I set up an appointment with a family law attorney in a suburb 40 minutes from our neighborhood, paid cash for the consultation, and sat across from a woman named Miss Okafor. I'd found her through a legal referral service and laid out what I knew. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Have you considered that he may be planning to ask for a divorce himself?" I told her about the behavior changes. The meetings. Atlanta. The second phone. She nodded. In my experience, people don't usually build this kind of parallel financial structure unless they're planning an exit. They want the money mobile before the conversation happens. So what do I do? You do nothing visible, she said. You document everything. You protect what's legally yours. And you wait until the moment it's useful. The moment it was useful came on a Thursday evening in March. Cooper was at his grandmother's for the week, spring break. Grant came home early, which he almost never did. He was wearing a tie, which he almost never does on a Thursday. He sat down across from me at the dining room table the way someone sits down to deliver news they've practiced. "I think we both know this isn't working," he said. I looked at him. Okay. He seemed slightly thrown by how calm I was. He'd expected something else. Tears, maybe, or denial. I'd had 18 months to prepare. I was done with both. He said he wanted to keep the house, the business, the vehicles. He said he'd been talking to an attorney. His words were, "I've had some preliminary conversations," and that he thought a clean split was in everyone's best interest. He could give me a cash settlement, something reasonable, enough to get started. He said Cooper could live with me, which he presented as a gift. I sat very still and let him finish. "I think that sounds fair," I said. He blinked. That was not the answer he was expecting. The next morning, his mother called. She and I had never been close. She was a woman who assessed people by their usefulness to her son, and for years I had been maximally useful, which she mistook for approval. Now I was an obstacle to be managed. She came over that afternoon with a casserole dish and an expression of performed sympathy. She told me that Grant had always had a big life in him, that some people are meant for more than a quiet domestic existence, that she hoped I understood. Then she walked through my kitchen and commented on the backsplash I'd chosen, a little trendy, don't you think, and suggested I start thinking about what I might realistically afford on my own. I offered her coffee. She declined. She left. That evening, my closest friend since college, a woman I had known for 11 years, called to check in. Her name was Tessa. We'd met our freshman year, been bridesmaids at each other's weddings. She was warm and funny, and she listened well, and I trusted her the way you trust someone after a decade of genuine history. She asked how I was holding up. I said I was okay, still processing. She asked if Grant and I had talked about a timeline. I said we were figuring it out. 2 days later, Grant mentioned, casually, as if it had just occurred to him, that I probably shouldn't count on the Elmwood Street property as an asset because it had some complications. I had not told Grant I knew about the second mortgage. I had not told anyone except Miss Okafor. I looked at Tessa's last 3 texts, read them differently. It wasn't her fault, not entirely. She loved Grant the way some people love someone they never had a real chance with, at a safe distance, loyally with a hope they'd never quite given up. Grant would have known that. He was good at knowing things like that about people and storing them away for later. I stopped telling Tessa things, started telling her things that weren't true instead. Not cruel untruths, just misdirections. I mentioned I might be looking at apartments in Southend. 2 days later, Grant made a comment about Southend rents. I mentioned I was thinking of going back to my old firm. Grant asked me over dinner if I'd talked to anyone there yet. Tessa was useful then too, just not in the way she intended. The hardest part wasn't any of this. The The hardest part was Cooper. He was 7. He was old enough to feel the tension and young enough to not understand it, which is the worst possible age to be in a situation like this. He started waking up at night again, something he hadn't done since he was 4. He'd come pad down the hall to my room and curl up next to me without saying anything, and I'd lie there in the dark with my arm around him and think about what I was doing and whether it was worth it. It was worth it. I just had to keep reminding myself. Grant was careful around Cooper, I'll give him that. But he had a way of inserting himself as the reasonable parent, the fun one, the one who said yes when I said, let's wait and see. He took Cooper to the batting cages twice in 1 week, let him stay up an hour past bedtime, bought him a gaming system he'd been asking about for months. I was the logistics parent, the homework parent, the consistent one. Consistency is invisible until it's gone. Cooper started calling me Mom with a particular flatness that 7-year-olds get when they're trying to be neutral because they think that's what they're supposed to do. I hired Miss Okafor officially. She reviewed my 18 months of documentation. She cross-referenced the property records, the financial summaries, the business accounts. She found 3 things I'd missed. When she was done, she looked up and said, "Mrs. Harmon, you've essentially done half my job already." I told her about the separate account, the freelance income, my 401k, $148,000, never commingled, separate property under North Carolina law. She asked if I'd made a will recently. I hadn't. We updated it to include education trust for Cooper, with the 401k named as the funding source. Grant was not listed as a trustee. The trust was administered by Miss Okafor's firm. Then I asked Miss Okafor the same question I'd asked the Wind for 18 months. If he signs for the house and the business, does he sign for the debt too? She smiled, a careful professional smile. Every mortgage, every lien, every outstanding obligation attached to those assets becomes the sole responsibility of whoever assumes them. Yes. And there's nothing improper about that? If the debt is his to begin with, the debt is already in his name. You'd simply be declining to assume responsibility for assets that are underwater. That's not fraud, that's math. I told her I wanted to ask for almost nothing. She told me she'd advise against it. I explained why. She stopped advising against it. What followed was 3 months of the most controlled performance of my life. I showed up to every mediation session looking like someone who had quietly accepted defeat. I wore no jewelry. I kept my voice low. I was cooperative, reasonable, accommodating. I asked for my personal belongings, shared custody of Cooper, and a cash settlement of $45,000. Grant's attorney, a man named Mr. Kessler, expensive shoes, impatient energy, barely hid his surprise. He'd been braced for a fight. I gave him nothing to push against. Grant agreed within 48 hours. He told his golf friends I'd rolled over. His mother reported to extended family that I hadn't even tried. Grant posted a photo from a rooftop bar in Atlanta the following weekend. New chapter, new energy. He was wearing a new watch. I knew, because I still had visibility into the business accounts, that he'd put it on the company card. He was still spending borrowed money like it was his, still digging. Meanwhile, Tessa kept calling. Her voice had changed, less natural, more careful, the way people sound when they're performing concern rather than feeling it. I kept our conversations brief, told her I was managing, didn't tell her anything else. The mediation agreement was prepared. Miss Okafor drafted it with the main asset transfer document and a separate addendum, what she called a liability disclosure and assumption schedule. Every debt, every mortgage balance, every lien, every outstanding obligation attached to the house, the business, and the vehicles. 31 pages of what Grant Harmon was actually signing for. It was there in the documents. Plain language, properly disclosed. His attorney received the full package. Mr. Kessler called Ms. Okafor 2 weeks before the final hearing. He had concerns. He wanted to request a joint financial audit before they proceeded. Ms. Okafor told him she'd provide whatever documentation they needed. Grant overruled him. I heard about this through Ms. Okafor, who heard it from Mr. Kessler with an audible frustration in his voice that suggested this was not his first time being overawed by this particular client. Grant wanted it done. He had plans. He'd already told people he was closing this chapter. Mr. Kessler prepared a written advisement. Client has been informed that an independent financial review is strongly recommended prior to signing. Client has declined. Grant signed the advisement. He signed everything without reading it. That's the thing about people who are very confident they already know the answer. They stop checking whether they're right. The night before the final hearing, Grant sent me a text. "Thanks for keeping this civil. Better for Cooper." I read it twice. 15 seconds of grace I could have spent composing a response, and I just set the phone down and went to check on my son, who was sleeping with his arm thrown over his face the way he'd slept since he was a baby. I sat on the edge of his bed for a while, watched him breathe. The hearing was on a Wednesday morning in April, Family Court, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. I wore gray. I looked tired because I was tired. I'd been tired for 2 years. Grant arrived with Mr. Kessler. He was polished, easy, already mentally elsewhere. He nodded at me the way you nod at someone in a waiting room whose name you don't know. His mother was in the gallery. She had dressed for something celebratory. I noticed her earrings. The judge was the Honorable Francine Webb, 22 years on the family court bench. She had the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by people a long time ago. She reviewed the file. She looked at me the way judges look at women who are signing away large assets for small settlements, with that particular careful attention that asks, without asking, "Is someone making you do this?" "Mrs. Harmon," she said, "I want to confirm that you understand you're relinquishing your claim to the family home, the business, and associated vehicles. You helped build that business. Are you certain this is what you want?" I kept my voice even. "Yes, Your Honor. I just want what's best for my son." She studied me for another moment. Then she nodded and told us to proceed. The documents were distributed. Grant signed with the kind of momentum that said he'd already moved on in his head, barely pausing, barely reading. Mr. Kessler signed where required. Miss Okafor and I signed, slowly, carefully. Then Mr. Kessler reached the addendum. I was watching Grant when it happened. I was watching his face. Mr. Kessler's hand slowed. He turned back a page, then forward. His expression did not change in a dramatic way. He was a professional, and professionals keep their faces neutral. But his hand stopped moving. He leaned toward Grant and said something in a low voice. Grant's expression flickered. "What?" Mr. Kessler pointed to something on the page. Said something I couldn't hear. Grant took the document. He read it. I watched his eyes move across the lines, watched them stop. Watched him flip to the summary page at the back. The house, $280,000 second mortgage outstanding, $300,000 primary remaining. Net equity, $130,000 against a $590,000 debt obligation. The business, $340,000 credit line, $87,000 vendor obligations, $94,000 equipment financing. Total, $521,000 in liabilities, 2 vehicles, both financed. Combined remaining balance, $61,000. Total obligations he was assuming, just over $1.1 million. Total sellable asset value at current market, approximately $1.2 million in a clean sale, which the house was not positioned for given the mortgage structure. Net position, nearly break-even at best, deeply negative if the market moved or the business clients walked. Grant stood up. "This isn't right." His voice came out louder than I think he intended. "She's manipulated these numbers." Judge Webb's voice was flat. "Mr. Harmon, sit down. There are debts on here that, Mr. Harmon." A pause that landed like a period. "Sit." He sat. His hands were on the table. They were shaking slightly. The judge reviewed the liability disclosure. Then she looked at Grant. "Mr. Remonster, Harmon, these are obligations tied to assets in your name. mortgages you took out, business accounts you control. She paused. Are you telling this court that you were unaware of your own financial obligations? Silence. Mr. Kessler cleared his throat. He produced the advisement letter, the one Grant had signed 2 weeks prior, declining the financial audit. He placed it before the judge without commentary. His face said everything his professionalism prevented him from saying out loud. Judge Webb read it. Mr. Harmon was advised to conduct an independent financial review. He declined. He acknowledged declining in writing. She looked at Grant. Is that your signature? A very long pause. Yes. Then you assumed this risk voluntarily, with full opportunity to investigate and full disclosure provided. She set the paper down. The agreement stands. Grant turned to me. His face had gone somewhere I'd never seen it go before. Not anger exactly. Something more like the expression of someone who has just realized the map they've been following doesn't show where they are. You knew, he said. Low, almost quiet. You've known this whole time. I ran your books for 5 years, I said. I knew everything. There were other things I could have said. I didn't say them. It wasn't the time, and I didn't need to. Judge Webb brought the gavel down. Mrs. Harmon, you have your settlement. Mr. Harmon, you have the assets as agreed and all associated obligations. This marriage is dissolved. I picked up my bag, smoothed my jacket, walked out of courtroom 7 without looking at Grant's mother, who was sitting in the gallery with an expression I would have paid money to photograph. In the hallway, I called my mother. She answered on the first ring. It's done, I said. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, come home. I'll make dinner. The weeks after were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, exactly, but quiet. Grant's company started showing the cracks within the first month. 2 of his main clients, ones I'd personally managed the contracts for, received notification that the company was under financial review and quietly moved their business elsewhere. The line of credit was frozen when payments fell behind. A vendor filed a mechanics lien against the business assets. His office manager, a woman who'd been with him 6 years, gave notice. The condo in Atlanta became his primary residence when the house went into pre-foreclosure. I heard this from his cousin, who called me out of concern for Cooper and ended up staying on the phone with me for an hour. The cousin told me the woman from Atlanta had ended things within weeks of the hearing. She thought she was getting a successful businessman. What she got was a man fielding calls from a collections firm. The new watch, the one charged to the company card, showed up in a lot that Mr. Kessler's firm sent me as part of the asset settlement documentation, company property. It got added to the liquidation list. I did not feel sorry for him. I had felt sorry for him at various points over the past 2 years, in private moments late at night, the way you feel sorry for anyone you spent a decade of your life loving. But that was before I understood that his plan had always included me losing. His plan had always been to walk out with everything and leave me standing in a house he'd mortgaged 3 times over, holding a settlement check for $45,000 and no clear claim to anything we'd spent years building. I didn't let him execute that plan. That's not the same as cruelty. That's just refusing to lose on someone else's terms. Tessa and I haven't spoken since a brief, strange phone call about 2 months after the hearing where she said she hoped I didn't think she'd meant any harm. I told her I didn't think she'd meant it. I also told her I needed space, which was polite language for something I didn't need to explain further. There are some friendships that can absorb betrayal and grow stronger, and there are some that can't, and you save everyone involved by acknowledging it clearly and moving on. I moved on. Cooper is doing better. He went back to sleeping through the night about 6 weeks after the hearing, which I track more carefully than I'll ever admit out loud. He asked me once, about 3 months in, why Dad had to move to Atlanta. I told him that sometimes adults make decisions that change where they live, but that his dad loved him and that would never change. Then I changed the subject to what he wanted for dinner, which is the parenting equivalent of a hard cut to a new scene. He started asking me to help him with his math homework, which he used to ask Grant to do. I'm better at it anyway. Numbers have always been my thing. The 401k is sitting where it's been sitting, now formally protected under the trust Ms. Okafor administers. Cooper's college is funded. His future has a floor under it, solid and completely outside the reach of whatever happens next in either of our lives. I went back to consulting. Not to my old firm, to my own firm technically, because I filed an LLC 3 weeks after the hearing and started taking clients in the area I know best, financial auditing for small and mid-sized businesses. Specifically, businesses where one partner suspects another of mismanaging accounts. My first 3 clients found me through word of mouth. All 3 of them were women. My mother came to visit last month. She stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, smaller than the house, much smaller, but every single thing in it chosen by me, and looked at the paint color I'd chosen for the accent wall. A warm terracotta. Deliberate, not trendy. "You seem like yourself," she said. I thought about that, about what it means to seem like yourself after spending years being someone's infrastructure, someone's unpaid everything, someone's person who kept the records he assumed she'd never really read. "I think I'm getting there," I said. She nodded, poured 2 cups of coffee, handed me one. "Your grandmother used to say that the smartest thing a woman can do," she said, "is know exactly what she's worth before anyone else decides for her." I thought about all the months I'd spent at the kitchen table, legal pad, numbers that didn't lie. I thought about 31 pages of liability disclosure. I thought about a judge who called him by his name and told him to sit down. "Yeah," I said, "I'm starting to figure that out." People ask me sometimes, usually women who've heard pieces of this story, what the turning point was. When did I know I was going to be okay? And I always have to think about it for a second, because it wasn't the hearing. It wasn't the moment the judge brought the gavel down or the moment I walked out of that courthouse into the April air. It was earlier than that. Much earlier. It was the night I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and did the math on my own life. Not Grant's version of our life. The one with the polished house and the growing company and the appearance of something solid. My version. The numbers I actually knew because I was the one who'd always known them. That night something shifted, not from fear to courage. It wasn't that clean. More like from confusion to clarity. I stopped asking why he'd done it and started asking what I was going to do about it. That's the thing nobody tells you about being betrayed by someone you trusted completely. The anger is real, but it's not actually useful by itself. Anger without a plan is just noise. What got me through wasn't rage. It was the same thing that had made me good at my job for years. The ability to sit with uncomfortable information, not flinch from it, and figure out what it meant. Grant made a choice. He chose to borrow against everything we built together, to run a parallel life on money that wasn't his, to walk away and leave me holding a settlement check in a house he'd mortgaged 3 times over. That choice had consequences, not because the universe punished him. It doesn't work that way, and I don't think in those terms. But because choices made on borrowed time and borrowed money eventually come due, they always do. He signed for assets he never actually understood, and that signature meant something. His name was already on the debt. I just declined to share it. Tessa's part in this still sits with me differently. Grant was never going to be someone other than who he was. I understand that now, but Tessa had been my friend. That particular kind of betrayal doesn't resolve the same way. I've made peace with it the way you make peace with a scar. It's there. It's mine. I don't have to pretend it doesn't exist. I also don't have to build my life around it. Cooper sleeping through the night again is the metric I use for whether things are actually better. Not my bank balance. Not my client list. Him. The night he padded down the hall to my room and I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd done that. That was when I knew. What I keep coming back to is something my mother said, that the smartest thing a woman can do is know what she's worth before anyone else decides for her. I spent 5 years running a company I didn't own, building something I wasn't credited for, trusting someone who was already planning my exit. I was good at all of it, smart enough to see what was happening, patient enough to wait for the right moment, disciplined enough not to burn it down just because I was furious. That's not a story about revenge. It's a story about a woman who finally used what she was already good at for herself. I think about that sometimes, in the quiet of my new apartment, the terracotta wall catching the morning light in a way I chose deliberately. I built the right thing. It just took me a minute to understand that I deserved to keep it.